Hello, fellow lovers of the liminal and the weird, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. Today I'm going to be doing a deep read on Haruki Murakami's Kafka on the Shore. I've already done a review and introduction to this piece, so if you haven't seen that video, it is the video right before this one. Go back and give that a watch because it will make more sense for you to have seen that and gotten the publication history and so on and so forth about this novel before jumping into the deep dive. Like all of my deep reads, I'm recording this as a tool for people that want to see my interpretation of books that are strange, I say weird, but that can be hard to understand. And I record these with the concept in mind that you have read the book. Of course, I have no control over whether or not you've read the book, and it doesn't matter. But just know that I'm going to be moving parts of the story around in order to present my interpretation of this book in a way that makes sense. So this will not be a chapter-by-chapter breakdown or summary of the book. It is my interpretation of what the meaning of this book is. These are my favorite videos to make. I really love diving deep into literature. It's what I originally was hoping to do on this channel. And they're not usually my most watched videos, but they do get a lot of wonderful comments, and that really makes it worthwhile for me. Plus, I just love talking about them. And this one that we're talking about is an interesting one because I think it is the most famous book I've talked about thus far, and it is the one that I think is the most divisive that I've talked about thus far. So just to say right off the bat, we are going to be dealing with some a little bit of gore and some sexual violence when we discuss this book, which of course is one of the reasons that it is so divisive. But also, it's in the Murakami canon, I think one of his hardest to understand books. He's writing, in my opinion, at the height of his metaphors and imagery and mystery and riddles without really solving all of them for us. I feel like this book wraps up very strongly, and of course I'll be going over that as we go on through the video. But a lot of people feel like this is just mystery on top of mystery on top of mystery with no explanation. So hopefully my interpretation will help give an explanation to some of those. All right. Let's get into it. This book opens with a young man who is 15 and running away from home. The exact reason that he's running away from home were not really given at the beginning of the book. He has a invisible friend / person he talks to in his head / version of himself that he converses with. Person named Crow. So it's him and this thing / person. We're going to be doing a lot of this as we talk about this novel named Crow. I think Crow could be considered an imaginary friend that I'm going to start calling this character Kafka right away, because he becomes Kafka later in the novel and we know him as Kafka all the way throughout the novel. So this kid that's running away is Kafka. That's the name he gives himself. We never learn his actual name. So he has this imaginary friend that seems to have more wisdom than Kafka, and this guy's name is Crow. Read that the name Kafka can mean crow. I forgot what language it was in. But yeah, Kafka, one of the meanings of the name Kafka is crow, so that is interesting. So Kafka talks to this imaginary friend named Crow. Could be like a superego. It could just be, I don't know if everybody thinks like this, but I know I constantly am having kind of imaginary conversations in my head, and I'm a bit of an overthinker. And a lot of those times, some of those voices will have, or some of those conversations that I have will be the voices of people that I know or have known in the past, and so on and so forth. So it might be a situation like that. Either way, he communicates with this other boy named Crow that we're just going to call his imaginary friend from now on, because that is the easiest way to discuss it. Kafka seems precocious for a boy his age. He thinks very deeply, and obviously has some trouble at his home, which is one of the reasons that he's running away. There are hints that his dad neglects him. He and his dad don't ever talk. But there's also hints of some kind of curse or prophecy, and this is narrated from Kafka's point of view. It's in first person, and he is a young man. He's only 15, so he's constantly trying to explain things, whether to us or to Crow, and he's not able to put them into words in a way that makes it very easy to understand. At the beginning here, he tries to talk about his feelings and ends up talking about a sandstorm. And I'd like to read just this quote to you here from the beginning. Sometimes fate is like a small sandstorm that keeps changing directions. You change direction, but the sandstorm chases you. You turn again, but the storm adjusts. Over and over you play this out like some ominous dance with death just before dawn. Why? Because this storm isn't something that blew in from far away, something that has nothing to do with you. This storm is you, something inside of you. So all you can do is give in to it. Step right inside the storm, closing your eyes and plugging up your ears so the sand doesn't get in, and walk through it step by step. There's no sun there, no moon, no direction, no sense of time, just fine white sand swirling up into the sky like pulverized bones. That's the kind of sandstorm you need to imagine. The reason that I wanted to read you this quote right off is because this is, I think, what is really powerful about this book. And it's also what makes it feel a little bit like a riddle. A lot of these things could be considered mundane, but through the eyes of this child, they're not mundane. Everything in the world is the opposite of mundane for a child. Time seems to take forever. Words from adults or other peers seem to hold way more importance than they actually do. Being a teenager is one of the weirdest parts of life, and this whole, at least the Kafka portions of this book, are from the point of view of a teenager, and that makes it very hard to follow, but I also think it makes it seem very authentic. The entire time I was reading this book, I felt like Murakami was doing a great job writing a precocious teenage boy. I have seen some reviews where people say that the kid is obviously way too smart and way too well-spoken for his age, and they didn't feel like he was well-written. I disagree with those. And I'm going to be pointing out throughout this entire deep read a lot of the moments that I felt like Kafka absolutely was demonstrating the action and thinking style of a 15-year-old boy. But I also think that we don't give enough credit to teenagers and how they think. We have a tendency as we get older to look back at how we were at 15 and go, oh my God, I was a complete idiot, which I'm guilty of. But although teenagers absolutely lack wisdom, they do not have the life experiences to be able to see the red flags that adults can and know how to avoid situations that adults could easily avoid, doesn't mean that teenagers can't be intelligent and deep thinkers. And I think that's what Kafka is. Okay. Anyway, there are hints that his dad neglects him, and he also seems to have a deep hatred for his DNA. He feels like he's invaded by the DNA that his parents gave him. And at the core of this novel is Kafka's coming-of-age story. So that kind of becomes a theme. parents and how children separate from parents and what parents give to their children by raising them. We'll get into all this later. Kafka lives alone with his dad. His mother and sister left when he was 4 years old. He doesn't remember the face of his mother. He does have one picture that's he and his sister on the beach. So he has a picture of his sister when she was younger. Of course, she's a little bit older than him, and it turns out she is adopted. So Kafka's mom, when she left, took her adopted child and not her full-blood child that was Kafka. So Kafka, part of the reason that he's running away is that he wants to track down and find his mother and sister. Okay, this is one of the times that I'm just going to have to give away a theme in the novel that comes up later, and this is going to be happening a lot through the deep read, so we can discuss these things at the time when they first come up. Murakami himself has said that this is a book of riddles, and one of the best ways to solve and understand this book is to read it multiple times. This, of course, is my second read. And what I do for these deep reads is take copious amounts of notes. That way I can look back and start to understand my interpretation of these texts. And one of the things that multiple readings of this text will give you is it will allow you to line up a lot of the events that occur in this novel, because there's two different sides to this novel. There's the Kafka story and there's the Nakata story, and those two lines are not presented chronologically one after the other. They're completely offset. So a lot of themes are introduced in this book before the plot points are introduced that tell us how to look at these things. So I'm going to bring it up now. Later, Kafka tells the story that ever since he was like 5 years old, his dad has prophesied in front of him that Kafka is going to kill him, his dad, and sleep with his mother and sister. And this is where we start to realize that this book is a rewriting, in a sense, or a reinterpretation or a deep look at the Oedipal curse. And I think it even goes farther than that, right? It's not just a retelling of that story. It's also a deep look into the Freudian idea of the Oedipal complex, right? What does it mean to say that every boy wants to kill his father and sleep with his mother? And I know that enough time has passed that that is starting to show for the ridiculousness that really was, and that Freud was maybe describing himself more than all young men across the planet, or all young people across the planet. But this book really does consider what that would actually look like if that were the case. So it stems from this father, and we'll get into why the father says this to his 5-year-old kid later. But it stems from the father. As Kafka grows up, his father is constantly repeating this prophecy, which Kafka also calls a curse, to the extent that one of the reasons Kafka's running away is, one, to find his mother and sister, probably to stop himself from fulfilling this prophecy, and two, to get away from his dad's neglectful weirdness. But this is an idea of where this book is going to take you. A lot of people have made videos about how weird Murakami is with his sex in his books, and I agree with a lot of that. I think that it started to... Nope, I can't even say that. There's weird sex all the way back to the beginning. Yeah, there is weird sex in Haruki Murakami's books. One small aspect of it is cultural, I believe. The Japanese culture is simultaneously more personally closed about sexual relationships, but culturally more open about sexual relationships. And this is, in my opinion, one of the tamest writers from Japan when it comes to this kind of thing. If you remember, I did The Ring a little while back by Koji Suzuki, and there was rape, and Sadako had testicles, and there seems to be in a lot of Japanese literature a sexual aspect. And if you look at Tanizaki, you'll see a lot of it there. If you look at Mishima, you'll see a lot of it there. They seem to look with unclouded eyes more directly at things that we consider taboo in writing. The extreme side of this would be Haruki Murakami, who wrote Coin Locker Babies, which is one of the most intense books that I have ever read. This kind of stuff pales in comparison. But I think what's happened is Murakami has become so popular that a lot of people are reading him that don't have any connection to Japanese culture. And they open this book expecting something similar to what Western writers do, and are kind of shocked because there is gore in this, and there is Murakami sex in this, which gets super weird, and there is sexual assault in this. That is more shocking to a Western audience than it is to a Japanese audience. But that's not the only thing going on here. I don't want to take away the responsibility that Murakami has for writing what he writes. That's one small aspect of it. Dang it, I lost my train of thought. I wanted to get that and then circle back around to... Oh. But with that aside, this novel specifically is dealing with the Oedipal complex, which makes you instantly realize that it's going to go to some places that are very uncomfortable. That story, even the original Greek story, is uncomfortable, right? The Oedipus at the end is so disgusted by his actions that he pokes his own eyes out because he can't handle seeing what he's done. This is shocking material, and this book includes the shocking material that you'd expect from a retelling of the Oedipal curse. All right, I'm taking way too long. So he's decided to run away. He takes money. No, he doesn't choose. Maybe he takes some money from his dad. Anyway, I can't remember. But he does take his dad's cell phone with him. He grabs his dad's cell phone, takes off, and this is super premeditated. We actually go into a history where he's been working out and trying to get as buff as he can to look older than he is. And many people think he's a 17-year-old, which is what he was going for. So he gets on a bus, and he's randomly decided to go to Shikoku. Shikoku Island is the smallest of the major Japanese islands. And that's where he's decided to go. He chose it because it sounded right. There was nothing behind this at all. He just was trying to randomly decide a place, and he decided on that one. This book is about fate because, of course, Oedipus Rex is about fate. And can you avoid prophecy? And, of course, in the original Oedipus, he runs into prophecy, literally trying to run away from the prophecy, which is true in this novel as well. So one can ask, did he choose Shikoku on accident or randomly, or was fate forcing him to choose Shikoku? So he gets on a bus, sleeps overnight. The bus stops at a rest stop. He goes in and gets some food at the rest stop. And while he's sitting down to eat, a young woman, an adult, but so older than him, but a young woman comes and sits with him, and she's very extroverted and very outgoing. And Kafka is a very introverted individual. He doesn't talk a lot. So she talks to him, and he responds the best he can, and she takes a real liking to him. He even mentions to her that he's looking for his sister. Maybe. I think he does mention to her there when they're talking that he's looking for his sister. Anyway, they get on the bus and decide to sit together, and she falls asleep and lays her her head on his arm or on his shoulder while she's sleeping. And he thinks to himself, wouldn't it be nice if this was my sister? And then he sees down her shirt and can see the swell of her breast, and he gets an erection. And this theme is going to play throughout this novel. And it's important to stare at it directly, because Murakami does stare at this concept throughout the entire book. And it is uncomfortable, right? Why is it that every time, well, I don't want to say why is it, every time this young man meets a woman that sexually attracts him, he instantly wonders if it's his sister or his mom. So this theme comes up really, really quickly. Almost as if the concept that it is his sister or his mom is connected to the eroticism he feels for these women. And I think that is absolutely the case. I think this is a demonstration of how effed up it is that his dad kept telling him this prophecy that he was going to sleep with his mother and kill his dad and sleep with his sister. It's obsessed him. He has taken this concept into himself as if it is his fate. Oh, before I move on from this, this is where he makes up the name Kafka for himself. And it's because Sakura asks him, what is your name? And he says Kafka off the top of his head. And I want to talk really quick about his choice there. Kafka, of course, wrote The Castle and The Trial. Franz Kafka did. And he created in those two stories a narrator named K. And K is very unique because he has a tendency to have things happen to him and constantly react. And that is very similar to a lot of Murakami's characters. But also, K doesn't connect with the systems, the social systems around him well, whether it be the bureaucratic or the jurisdictional or whatever. I think that's how you say that word. He doesn't connect well to society, and he finds it all to be absurd, which is why Kafka wrote absurdism. Yeah, his narrator K finds these institutions to be absurd, and I think that Kafka in Kafka on the Shore connects to that idea. I do want to mention also, and this isn't my original reading, but there is a scholar that thought maybe this was a pun. The name Kafka in Japanese is pronounced Kafka, and it's actually Ka-fu-ka, and Ka by itself can mean possible or good. And fuka by itself can mean bad or unacceptable. And I think that is an awesome way to look at this. I'm going to find out this scholar's name really quick. Hayao Kawai is the one that first noticed this possible pun. And I think that is brilliant. Because Kafka is a young man that is about to become an adult. And there is darkness inside all of us, and there is good and lightness inside all of us. And I think that when we are very young, when we are just getting rid of the selfishness of childhood and becoming teenagers, which is a liminal stage right before adulthood where we practice adulthood, where we juggle the selfishness of childhood and the selflessness of adulthood, there's this moment where teenagers have to decide if they're going to embrace this darkness or if they're going to embrace this goodness. And I love that the name Kafka implies that inherently. Really brilliant. Anyway, once they get off the bus, she is worried about him. I think she can tell he's a runaway and doesn't really have a place to stay, so she is worried about him. And she does the best thing that she can, which is give him her phone number and say, call me if you want to hang out sometime. And this proves to be incredibly helpful to Kafka later. So one of the places that he decided to visit when he picked this random town to go to was a library. And it's a very interesting library because it is based on a personal collection of books that was collected by a rich businessman named Komuda. And Komuda had a house built. I think it's Japanese. Yeah, it is a Japanese style. Is it Western? He had a house built specifically to house his personal collections of books, and now it's been opened to the public. I assume with an endowment from his personal fortunes. Of course, he's long gone now. But his collection focused on tanka poetry and haiku poetry from Japanese artists. I think it was specifically around the Meiji period, and a lot of them would come and visit this library. And Kafka doesn't care about classical Japanese poetry, but he does like libraries, and he realizes that a library is a great place for somebody that should be in school to hang out if they're not going to be in school, right? Truant officers are not going to be looking at libraries to try to find kids that are skipping school. So he's decided this library is a perfect place to hang out. So he gets a hotel. He finds a gym, which is a little bit unsafe. It is a place that he could be caught for truancy, but he very much is into his workout routine. And he decides to spend his days in this library. So he goes to the library. When he first walks into the library, he meets a man named Oshima who works at the front desk there as a receptionist in the library. And he's instantly taken by the friendliness of this guy. And also he describes him as pretty. He asks if he can use the library. Oshima says, of course. Just don't eat in here. You can eat out in the garden. And Kafka goes in and decides what he's going to read in order to pass his days. And what he chooses is Richard Burton's translation of the Arabian Nights. And this is a choice that makes perfect sense to me and is connected to other Japanese literature. Just really quick, Richard Burton was a translator that when he took the Arabian Nights, he decided to take the random sexual aspects of the novel and increase them. So he over-sexualized these tales, ignoring the kind of truth of the translation, and really hyped that up for the readers. Because of that, they were banned in a lot of places, and one of those places was Japan. And I want to speak specifically for just a second about the history of these books in Japanese literature. And I promise this won't be a long aside. I just really quickly wanted to talk about Yukio Mishima's Spring Snow. One of my favorite Japanese writers and one of my favorite Japanese novels. And I'm going to do this book on the channel sometime, so I'm not going to go into it a lot. But the beginning of this takes place in the Taisho era, and a large portion at the front of this is about one of the characters in the book securing a copy, I think an illegal copy, of the Burton translation of the Arabian Nights translated into Japanese with erotic pictures added. And to the Japanese at this time, everything Western was in vogue. So being able to have a book that included erotic themes was very exciting to especially the men of the time. Also, the fact that he specifically speaks of Richard Burton's translation of the Arabian Nights, I think is a nod to the concept of the sexuality that we'll see in this book. The over-sexualizing of specifically Kafka and his youthful sex drive throughout this entire novel. While he's sitting reading the Arabian Nights, he has a moment where he looks up and looks around the library, and he decides that this is his perfect place. When he would daydream about getting away from it all, this library embodies everything he wanted in a place, and I found that really beautiful. One thing is that when I was a child, I constantly thought about places, and I even dreamt about different places. That is a form of escapism, right? And I think that in that sense, we see another example of how well Murakami is writing a 15-year-old. The constant escapism is perfectly stated here in his love of this library that he's found. He eats lunch and he talks with Oshima, and they're very quickly, just over this one day, starting to develop quite a friendship. And Oshima has a tendency to... He's definitely a reader, but so is Kafka. Kafka is also a very well-read individual. So they have a tendency to speak in literary terms, and I'll get into that more in a minute. But Oshima brings up Plato's Symposium, and I want to read the quote that he talks about with that. In ancient times, people weren't just male or female, but one of three types: male-male, male-female, or female-female. In other words, each person was made out of the components of two people. Everyone was happy with this arrangement and never really gave it much thought. But then God took a knife and cut everybody in half, right down the middle. So after that, the world was divided just into male and female. The upshot being that people spend their time running around trying to locate their missing other half. I'm not sure I've ever read Plato's Symposium, so I can't speak to the veracity of this statement. But I love the idea, and Murakami, I'm sure, is absolutely quoting something real. And I think this is such a wonderful idea, and it means I'm going to have to bring up Oshima, and this is something that is revealed later in the novel, but I'm going to bring it up right now. Oshima was born a woman, has never felt like a woman, has always felt like a man, identifies as a man, but he also identifies as a homosexual man, so he only goes out with other men. And this is very unique for the time. And the first time that I read this, of course I was familiar with the concept of trans at that time, but I think Murakami was writing about this pretty early, and I love that. And I love this character. Oshima, for me, is the star character throughout this entire novel. For Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, it's the professor's granddaughter. For Kafka on the Shore, it's all Oshima. He is incredible, and he becomes Kafka's friend and mentor through all of this. It's really, really brilliant. And I think that when Oshima explains this, he at the end of, after they talk about this symposium for a while, he says, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it's hard to be alone. Right? Which is a great point, especially if you consider the fact that people used to be combined and now they are divided. But it also speaks to Oshima's connection to gender. And of course, we're going to have to talk about liminality. And I did it a lot in the other video, but I'm just going to bring it up really quick here. Kafka is on the border of choosing to be a good human being or a bad human being. He's also on the liminal border of being a young man about to become an adult. And here we see Oshima is on the kind of gender, the liminal space between gender, but also on a liminal space between sexuality. He's not just trans, he's trans and gay. And so we have these two steps for Oshima, which I think is really, really wonderful. Okay. Also, I think it comes up because a lot of this novel is about perception, about how to perceive the world. But it's also about connection. How do we connect to other people? And the concept of love connections are explored very thoroughly in this book. But also just how two people can't ever truly perceive each other. And there's quotes that we'll get into that later. But yeah, this is a theme. This is the first piece of literature that leads us into the theme of what this novel is going to be about. Later that day, he goes on a tour of the library, which is given by the head librarian, which is a woman named Miss Psyche. And she's a middle-aged woman, and he is very taken with her right away. She's very elegant. And, of course, this being Kafka, his thought, once he's enjoyed the tour and really specifically feels a connection to Miss Psyche, is that he wishes that somebody like her would be his mother. Again, we find this obsession with this Oedipal concept that Kafka has. And I think the reason that Oshima and he can be really good friends is because Oshima is not a woman. Every time Kafka meets a woman, it's either his mother or his sister in his brain. Every time. And it puts a wall up. It makes it very difficult for women to get close to Kafka. But men, because they don't play a role other than killing his father, in this prophecy that's been shoved down his throat since he was 5, men aren't part of that, so he can relax around men, and I think that's why he and Oshima can connect. Of course, later there is he, I think, wonders at points if Oshima could be his sister once he finds out that Oshima was born a woman. So a few days pass. Every day he goes to the gym and then goes to the library. He's just kind of treading water. He's run away. And he talks with Oshima every time he's at the library. And one of their conversations, they start talking about the fact that his name is Kafka, that he chose the name Kafka. And he's pretty honest with Oshima right away. He tells Oshima that he made up the name Kafka and that he's run away and that he hasn't finished middle school and that he's 15. He tells him all that right away. So they discuss Kafka, and they discuss specifically the story in the penal colony, which is one of Kafka's more well-known stories. And it's a story about people trying to invent a device for execution, and they make it insanely complicated. And Oshima is allowing Kafka to try and express the way that he interprets that story as a metaphor of the life around him. However, Kafka doesn't have the words to describe it, and he gets tongue-tied. He can't really explain. All he can say is life is like that machine, which is not a really deep and educated way to present an interpretation of a story. And Kafka realizes that and feels tongue-tied, and later thinks to himself that he couldn't tell Oshima that he feels like that machine is all around him. Basically, he feels like the machine is going to execute him, which speaks wonderfully about what it means to be a youth, what it means to be a teenager, to feel like the whole world's against you, to have all this rebellion inside of you, whether it's deserved or not, is unimportant. It's instinctual, hormonal rebellion and anger, and yeah, it can feel like the world is this machine about to execute you. Again, the fact that he made him tongue-tied is very 15-year-old, and the fact that Kafka thinks of the machine this way is very 15-year-old. I think Murakami's doing an incredible job writing this character. Okay, enough about Kafka. Let's go to the other narrative in this text. is Nakata. And Nakata, it's weird. The first time I read this, I think I really connected with Kafka. And the second read through, I think I really connected with Nakata. Really interesting and wonderful character with a very strange intro in this novel. So, like I said, these two stories are intermingled chapter by chapter. All the odd chapters are about Kafka. All the even chapters are about Nakata. So that all that I just told you about Kafka is, we've gone deep into Kafka's story in the book. I've been ignoring all of Nakata's story because I just figured I'd tell each of them up into the point that they start to weave together. And Nakata's story at the beginning, Kafka's is interesting. Nakata's is the magical realism. Like everything that we just talked about Kafka's story, there was no magical realism in there, right? It's all weird. Like he definitely comes from a weird family, but there's nothing magical in that. Nakata is where things get wacky. And of course, Murakami wants to keep that wackiness going throughout the entire book, so he goes back and forth from chapter to chapter. Anyway, we are first not even introduced to Nakata. We're introduced to this event that occurred in November of 1944 near the end of World War II. There's a teacher and a group of students that were on a field trip collecting mushrooms, and they go up into this kind of mountain area to collect these mushrooms, and all of them see a strange object in the sky. And right away, the book is quick to prove that it's not a B-29, which is what they all think it is. They think it's some kind of American ship, a bomber, basically, which of course is terrifying to them. But the book includes reports from American files later that say there were no B-29s in that area. The book very emphatically is like, that is not a B-29. This is an unidentified flying object. And they see it, they start collecting mushrooms, and suddenly all the kids pass out at once. Super creepy. And the teacher's just standing there like, what? And she starts looking at the kids, freaking out, and all of their eyes are moving like crazy, right? They're passed out, but their brains are super active, and they're obviously seeing something inside their head. And the teacher doesn't pass out, so she's standing there freaked out, thinking like, should I carry all these kids down the mountain? What am I going to do? So she just books it and goes and gets the town doctor. And he comes up the mountain, and he's looking at the kids, and he's definitely like, yeah, these kids are seeing something. They're not just passed out. They are literally looking at something inside their head. And right about the time that he figures that out, all the kids start to wake up. And he's testing them, and they seem fine. And all of the kids wake up except for one, and that is a little boy named Nakata. And he's a transfer student from Tokyo, come out to the rural community there in order to avoid getting bombed in Tokyo, which about half of her class is this group of kids from Tokyo. Yeah, he doesn't wake up, and he's in a coma for 3 weeks, and he's taken away by the military because the military's afraid that this might be some kind of new American attack. But that is ruled out. They can't say what it is, and of course, I'm thinking aliens. And the first time I read this book, like, my whole interpretation surrounds aliens, and I'm going to give you that original interpretation while I give you my other interpretation of this book. Now, I don't think so much that it is aliens, but it's weird because I feel like Murakami is pointing a lot at aliens. Look at the cover of this book. We should make sure to hold it so that the sun isn't glaring. Look, I mean, how close is that to a gray? Come on. Thin neck and weird eyes and bobbly head. I don't know. So yeah, I feel like it's Murakami's fault that we're thinking aliens here, and it could still be aliens. I mean, we're gonna talk about this in great depth as we go. And if you read the Wikipedia page, whoever wrote that synopsis of the Wikipedia page really is like, does not believe this is aliens. And I can see where they're coming from, because on my second read through, when I really mapped this out, the concept of aliens got farther and farther away. But I'll still tell you kind of what I thought as we go. It turns out that the story told by the teacher wasn't 100% true. And we get this letter that she eventually wrote to the professor that was studying the case, where she tells the true story. And the true story is that the night before this teacher took these children on the field trip, she was dreaming of having sex with her husband, who she had recently married, on a large rock or stone on the top of a mountain. Remember rocks and stones, because these become very important throughout this novel. So we'll be looking back at this moment eventually. And it's a very intensely erotic and exciting dream. And she wakes up and masturbates, and then feels embarrassed and kind of disgusted with herself that she did that. So then she goes to work, and she's walking up the mountain with these kids, because it's her job. And the whole time she's walking, she's having daydreams about this sex dream. And that is really unprofessional, and she's starting to really get down on herself for thinking like that. And then all of a sudden her period starts, and it's starting very early. Like, she was not expecting this at all. And it doesn't just start a little bit, it starts heavy, much heavier than normal. So now she's worried about how much she's bleeding and why she's bleeding and so on and so forth. And Japanese culture has a tendency to connect concepts through correlation, especially if you think about the concept of karma, right? That everything happens as a response to how you've lived your life or what kind of person you've been. And so I'm sure that this person, this teacher, as she's walking up the hill, is falling apart in the sense that she's thinking that this bleeding in this period is a karmic reaction to thinking about that kind of stuff while she was walking up with the kids. She gets to the top. She has to do something about her bleeding, so she tells the children to pair up and go walk around, and she goes and finds a place way off. She walks way far away, and she has 2 towels with her, and she takes care of herself. And she leaves those towels there. And she's like, okay, I've cleaned myself up. She leaves the bloody towels and comes back to the kids, and they're all walking around and everything's good. And all of a sudden she sees this kid walking up to her, and he has something in his hands, and this is Nakata. And what he has in his hands are the bloody towels. And this embarrassment is just dreadful. And we have to remember it's a different culture and a different time for that culture. This embarrassment would be of a level that we couldn't understand. And she finally gives in to this nervous breakdown and starts smacking Nakata. And she just keeps beating him. And of course, she hates herself later for doing this, and this is awful. But also, people were quicker to punish with violence back at this time. And I don't want to say anything like what she did was okay. This is straight up child abuse. Like, she's beating on this kid. It's icky. And she suddenly kind of notices, after her rage seems to start to come down a little bit, she starts looking around and notices that all of the kids are staring at her. And I want to read this quote. "Suddenly I noticed all the children there staring at me. Some were standing, some sitting, all of them facing me. It was all right in front of them, me, pale, standing there. Nakata collapsed on the ground from all the blows, the bloody towels. It was a moment frozen in time. Nobody moved, Nobody said a word. The children were expressionless, their faces like bronze masks. A deep silence descended on the woods. All you could hear were the birds chirping. I can't get that scene out of my mind. I don't know how much time passed, probably not so long, but it seemed like forever. Time, driving me to the very edge of the world. Finally I snapped out of it. Color had returned to the world around me. I hid the bloody towels behind me and lifted Nakata up from where he lay. I held him tight and apologized to him as best I could. I was wrong. Please, please forgive me, I begged him. He looked like he was still in shock. His eyes were blank, and I don't think he could hear what I said. With him still in my arms, I turned to the other children and told them to resume their mushroom hunting. They probably couldn't comprehend what had just taken place. It was all too strange, too sudden. I stood there for a while, holding Nakata tight in my arms, feeling like I wanted to die or disappear. Just over the horizon, the violence of war went on, with countless people dying. I no longer had any idea what was right and what was wrong. Was I really seeing the real world? Was the sound of birds I was hearing real? I found myself alone in the woods, totally confused, blood flowing freely from my womb. I was angry, afraid, embarrassed. All of these rolled into one. I cried quietly without making a sound, and that's when the children collapsed. The reason I'm taking so long with this is because this event is the deciding factor of how Nakata gets wrapped up in all of this. And we're going to have to look at this a lot as we move on from here. So I wanted to come back to that quote, and we'll talk about it later on throughout the deep read. But it is interesting that I feel like there's time jumps in that quote. Like there's moments where she flashes in and out of time. And that's going to become very important. Of course, you will notice that in this case, there is no ship. And I don't know if that's because she starts her narrative... No, she doesn't. She starts her narrative going up the mountain. There's no unidentified flying object. Now, the kids, when they wake up in her version, don't remember anything happening with the bloody towels and Nakata and any of that. They don't remember any of the moments before that. Just like they don't remember the ship. So if she makes up this alien story, then none of the kids can remember any part of it. I'm gonna have to look and see if they remember seeing the ship or not. All right, that probably just seems like a quick cut for you, but for me, a day has passed, and last night, before I fell asleep, I was reading some chapters, going back and looking at them. Specifically, I wanted to find out about the unidentified flying object because that seems super important to me. And I was able to find a line that shows that the kids did see an unidentified flying object before any of the other stuff went down. So the true story is the teacher's story, but the UFO is actually in both of them, even though the teacher doesn't bring up the UFO. And this is on page 64 in my copy. The children had no memory whatsoever of the event. They saw what looked like a plane glinting high up in the sky. All the children reported that. Climbed up Owanyama and began hunting mushrooms. Then there's a gap in time, and the next thing they recall is lying on the ground. So the kids do see the UFO. The UFO actually existed and was seen by all of the children. So that is very cool. It allows us to continue thinking about the alien concept, because one of the ways that I think about writing is that an author puts everything in a text on purpose. And that's one of the things that this novel comes under fire for, is that it seems like Murakami is just making it up as he goes along, which of course all stories are made up. But the as he goes along is what's important here, that he didn't map a lot of this out. And Murakami himself has come out and said that he'll start writing a novel with no idea where it's going to go. And I agree that there are going to be readers that find that very troubling. The stuff that I've written, I am similar to Murakami. Is I'll sit down and start writing, and I'll create characters and situations that I'll start them in, and then I have to write all the way through to the end to see where this is going, and then I go back and rewrite with the beginning or with the end in mind. And I don't know if Murakami takes that step where he goes back and rewrites with the ending in mind, but I always consider that everything that an author puts in the book is in there on purpose and intended. So Murakami did put aliens in here, and I disagree with whoever was writing on the Wikipedia article that the teacher's story automatically takes away the aliens, because on that page with that quote that I just read, we see that the kids did indeed see the unidentified flying object either way. So that's important. And I know that does complicate the Shinto reading, and we're going to go over both simultaneously as we go. So I'm going to continue doing Nakata's backstory, which is stuff that we actually learn. Right away we learn about this encounter. The rest of this we learn way later in the novel, but I'm going to put it here now so that we know all we need to know about Nakata. I also want to add that I may break this video into 2 parts, depending on how long this goes, just because of editing. I might not even be able to get it up today if I tried to do the whole thing. So don't be surprised if there's a part 1, part 2 to this video. If this just ends randomly, just know that that's as far as the editing I could get before I had to put it up on the channel. So there will be a part 2. So Nakata's in a coma for 3 weeks, and he wakes up and he has forgotten everything, like total and complete amnesia. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know who anybody around him is. And it goes as far as he doesn't know how to read, how to write. He doesn't know what the earth is. He doesn't know anything. He is completely emptied, a blank slate. Now, his dad is an important businessman in Tokyo. And their family, especially his mother, really are obsessed with the education of their children. So when Nakata has to kind of restart learning, his parents kind of lose interest in him. And I know that's a very weird thing to say, but that's exactly what happens. They lose interest in him and send him to live with relatives. Really, once they realize that he's mentally handicapped. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of mentally handicapped, because I don't feel that's exactly what happened to Nakata. I feel like that's what everybody around him thinks. What I feel like happened is Nakata is straddling 2 different worlds. He went to another world while he was in that coma. That will be explained later as we go through the plot. He went to the other world while he was in that coma and left a part of himself in that other world. So he straddles both worlds, which is why he becomes so important throughout the book in order to deal with problems that opening or closing this other world causes. So he kind of understands the other world and understands how to read things in our world that connect to the other world, while simultaneously trying to relearn and understand our world. So the truth is, it's not that he is mentally handicapped. He is neurodivergent, but it's because he is straddling this liminal space. And to the regular people of Japan of his time, they can't understand this other world that he's a part of, that he has an understanding of. So he seems to do things in a way that looks slow or handicapped to them. But I don't think it is. Eventually, Nakata ends up with his grandparents, who absolutely love him. And they take care of him. And they have 2 cats. And that is when Nakata learns that he can talk to cats, which is one of the best parts of this book. And we don't get to see all this background that I'm giving you now. We basically hear about the UFO incident and then jump to meeting Nakata as an older man who can talk to cats. And the way that Murakami introduces this into the text is absolutely brilliant. He learns that he can talk to cats because his grandparents have two cats that love to just lay around the porch. And he is raised by his grandparents and their cats. These cats kind of catch him up and tell him everything he needs to know about the world, but he learns it all from a cat perspective, which I find beautiful and interesting. This kid growing up, sitting on the porch with his grandparents' cats, just chatting away with them. Once he gets older, he tries to go to agricultural college, but has to drop out because of how bad he is bullied in agricultural college. This is probably the late 60s, mid 60s, maybe even late 50s. So, of course, a different ideological time, and it was probably considered normal for kids to make fun of what they don't understand. I'm glad that we don't live in that time anymore. So that was kind of a sad part, but he ends up meeting a guy that makes a special kind of Japanese furniture, and Nakata starts working in the furniture factory and loves it. He's really good at it. He makes beautiful furniture, and he works in that factory for most of his adult life. He keeps that job until his boss, the guy that owns the factory, dies, and that guy's son doesn't want to take it over, so the factory is just closed and Nakata no longer has a job. But he does get a retirement payout, and it's a lot, and Nakata can't really understand numbers over a certain size, so he doesn't realize how much money he has. So his cousin takes care of his accounts, and his cousin gets into gambling debts and disappears with all of Nakata's money. So poor Nakata no longer has a job. He's lost all his money and he doesn't know what to do. But his father was very, very rich and very influential. And he has two brothers that are in government or in corporations. I can't remember exactly what they do. And one of them gets him an apartment in Tokyo and gets him a subsidy from the government in order to live. So Nakata starts living a simple life, living in Tokyo. He's retired. He's this kind of neurodivergent genius that's straddling two worlds and is able to talk to cats, and he's bored. So what does he do? He starts not really well, it's kind of a business. He starts finding lost cats, and he's super good at it, because he can go and talk to other cats in the neighborhood and figure out where these cats are. And when we first meet Nakata, he is talking to a cat. It's just this old guy, and he keeps calling himself not very bright and talks about the fact that he can't read. And he's talking to this cat, and he shows this cat a picture of another cat that he's looking for, a kitten named Goma. And the cat's like, yeah, I haven't seen her around here. Good luck. And as Nakata's leaving, the cat says, hey, I noticed that half of your shadow is missing. And if I were you, I would be looking around for the other half of your shadow instead of for lost cats. And the shadow thing, first off, right away reminded me of Hard-Boiled Wonderland in the End of the World, where people enter a town and their shadows get cut off and separated from them. So eventually, his detective work leads him to a cat named Mimi, who is a calico, and he says he can always talk to calicos the easiest. And Mimi tells him that Goma was spotted in an empty lot down the road, and that it's a lot that is known for having a cat kidnapper. And she says, this is a very bad man. You should not go to this area because this man is super bad, and he will abduct cats by putting food out and calling them. And certain cats, of course, are too rough and won't even go near him, even though he puts down food. But a cat like Goma could easily be caught. So Nakata goes to this empty lot and sits there. He just sits down and he thinks about the fact that he's Murakami tells us that he is not bored because Nakata can look inside of himself to avoid a nothingness that's always been there, where everything exists but nothing has shape, is the way that it's explained, and Nakata just kind of exists in that void within him while he's waiting for either Goma or this terrible man to show up in this empty lot. I think Murakami did an incredible job with Nakata. The way that he talks, the way that he's described by Murakami, and the way that other people around him react to him, all of it seems very real. And the duality of Nakata being simultaneously considered mentally handicapped in one world, but also considered to be almost like a prophet because of his ability to understand and read signs from the other world, is really incredibly done. And we'll get into that more as we go on. So that is Nakata. Now we have the Kafka storyline and the Nakata storyline all the way up to the first major plot point that brings these two narratives together in the first fold of the braid. And that will be part 3, the murder.